You've seen them. The person who walks into a room and something subtly changes. Conversations become more attentive. People seem to lean in without realizing it. There is no performance, no attempt to dominate the room, no need to prove anything. Yet their presence lingers. Long after they leave, people remember how they felt around them. Most assume this kind of magnetism is a gift reserved for a fortunate few, a natural charisma, a personality trait, something you either have or you don't. But the Stoics understood a different truth. The qualities that draw people towards someone are rarely loud or obvious. More often, they are quiet habits of character, practiced so consistently that they become part of who a person is. What makes this so fascinating is that the most magnetic people are often the least concerned with being magnetic. While others chase attention, they cultivate presence. While others seek validation, they develop self-command. They are not focused on being noticed. They are focused on how they carry themselves through the world. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the mind becomes colored by its habitual thoughts, and nowhere is that more visible than in the way a person moves, speaks, listens, and responds to the people around them. The calmness that puts others at ease, the steadiness that inspires trust, and the quiet confidence that never needs to announce itself are not performances. They are reflections of an inner life that has been carefully disciplined. And that changes the way magnetism is understood. It stops being something mysterious or reserved for a select few. It becomes something far more practical, a byproduct of self-mastery, the result of learning to govern impulses rather than obey them, to observe before reacting, and to remain grounded in situations that pull most people off balance. The qualities that make a person unforgettable rarely begin with other people at all. They begin within. And once that becomes clear, an entirely different way of thinking about connection starts to emerge. Most people begin losing their influence long before they ever open their mouths. It happens quietly, often without their awareness. They walk into a room already carrying a weight nobody else can see. Thoughts race beneath the surface. Am I making a good impression? Do I look confident enough? Am I saying the right thing? The mind becomes crowded with concerns about perception, and as attention turns inward, presence begins to fade. Instead of engaging with the people around them, they become absorbed in monitoring themselves. Every movement is examined, every word is evaluated, every silence feels dangerous. The result is subtle but powerful. They may be physically present, yet mentally they are somewhere else entirely. What makes this so fascinating is that people are far more perceptive than they realize. They may not consciously identify the source of someone's discomfort, but they can sense it. Emotional states are communicated constantly through posture, facial expressions, timing, and countless small signals that rarely reach conscious awareness. A person who feels tense often creates tension around them. Someone who seems uncertain about their place in a room often creates uncertainty around them. This is one reason first impressions are shaped by more than appearance or words. Long before a conversation begins, people are already responding to an emotional atmosphere. Many people spend years improving their communication while overlooking the state of mind it comes from. They focus on what to say, how to sound more interesting, or how to appear more confident. Yet the deeper issue often has little to do with technique. A mind consumed by self-consciousness struggles to connect because it is occupied with itself. Genuine connection requires awareness, and awareness cannot fully extend outward while it remains trapped inward. The more a person obsesses over how they are being perceived, the less available they become to the reality unfolding around them. This is why some individuals seem naturally magnetic, despite saying very little. Their influence is not rooted in performance. It comes from an unusual sense of ease. They are not constantly adjusting themselves in response to imagined judgments. They are not scanning every interaction for signs of approval or rejection. There is a steadiness about them that allows others to relax. Being around them feels different because they are actually present. Their focus is not fragmented by endless internal commentary. The Stoics understood something that remains deeply relevant today. They recognized that much of human suffering begins when people surrender control of their attention. The mind becomes reactive. Every opinion feels significant. Every criticism feels threatening. Every moment demands an immediate response. Yet freedom begins when a person learns to create space between stimulus and reaction. A pause may look insignificant from the outside. Internally, it changes everything. It transforms experience from something that happens to you into something you consciously participate in. Consider how quickly most people move through conversations. Questions are answered almost before they are finished being asked. Silences are filled the moment they appear. Reactions emerge instantly. Opinions are offered without reflection. There is often a subtle urgency underneath it all, as though slowing down might expose weakness or uncertainty. Yet the opposite is often true. Rushing tends to reveal anxiety. It communicates that stillness is uncomfortable. It suggests that silence must be escaped rather than inhabited. Seneca understood this well when he wrote, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." The wisdom extends far beyond anger. In many situations, the ability to pause is the ability to remain in command of yourself. A different quality emerges when someone becomes comfortable slowing the pace. Their movements become more deliberate. Their words become more considered. They listen fully before responding. They allow moments to breathe. Nothing feels forced because nothing needs to be rushed. This does not mean becoming passive or detached. It means remaining composed enough to choose responses rather than merely producing them. That distinction may seem small, but people notice it. They feel it even when they cannot explain it. There is something reassuring about a person who is not in a hurry to prove themselves. Their calmness sends a message that requires no words. It suggests they are comfortable enough with who they are, that they do not need constant validation from the environment around them. And that comfort spreads. Others begin lowering their own defenses. Conversations become less performative. Interactions become more genuine. The atmosphere shifts because one person has stopped feeding the collective pressure to impress. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself not to be carried away by every impulse that arose within him. He understood that the first reaction is not always the wisest one. The same principle applies in ordinary social moments. The urge to interrupt, explain, justify, impress, or defend often appears automatically, yet automatic does not mean necessary. When a person develops the ability to observe these impulses without immediately acting on them, a different kind of strength begins to emerge. It is quieter than outward confidence, but often far more powerful. The deeper truth is that stillness has very little to do with other people. It begins as an internal relationship. A person learns that silence does not need to be feared. Uncertainty does not need to be eliminated immediately. Not every moment requires action. Not every gap requires filling. As this understanding deepens, the mind becomes less reactive and more attentive. Energy once spent managing appearances becomes available for something far more useful: observation, listening, and genuine engagement. If these ideas resonate with you, consider subscribing as a reminder to keep returning to the work that matters most. The work of understanding your own mind, the work of becoming a little calmer, a little wiser, and a little less controlled by the noise around you. Real growth rarely arrives through dramatic breakthroughs. More often, it emerges through small moments of awareness repeated over time. If that journey matters to you, subscribing is a simple way to continue walking it. And perhaps that is where the deeper question begins. If stillness creates presence, what is it that makes another person feel truly seen? Think about the conversations that remained in your memory long after they ended. In most cases, it was not because the other person said something extraordinary. It was not because they delivered a perfect insight or told an unforgettable story. More often, what stayed with you was a feeling, a subtle sense that, for a few moments, someone was completely present with you. Their attention did not seem divided. Their mind was not wandering somewhere else. They were not waiting impatiently for their turn to speak. They were simply there, fully engaged, fully attentive. And that feeling, although difficult to describe, is becoming increasingly rare. Modern life has created an environment where attention is constantly under attack. Notifications compete for it. Deadlines demand it. Endless streams of information pull it in every direction. As a result, many people move through conversations carrying the same fragmented attention they bring into every other area of life. They hear words without truly listening. They nod while mentally rehearsing responses. They maintain eye contact while silently organizing their next thought. From the outside, everything appears normal. The conversation continues. Questions are asked. Answers are given. Yet something essential is missing beneath the surface. The absence is not always obvious, but people feel it. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to detect when attention is genuine and when it is merely being performed. Someone may smile, agree, and respond appropriately, yet still leave another person feeling unseen. Not because anything offensive was said, but because authentic engagement never occurred. The interaction becomes an exchange of words rather than an exchange of awareness. It satisfies the social requirement of conversation while failing to satisfy the deeper human desire for understanding. This tendency is not new. Long before smartphones, social media, and constant digital stimulation, the Stoics recognized how easily the mind becomes distracted from what is directly in front of it. They understood that wisdom begins with observation. Before a person can respond wisely, they must first learn to see clearly. Yet many people reverse this process. They become eager to express opinions before fully understanding what they are responding to. The impulse to contribute often arrives before the willingness to observe. Speech comes first. Understanding comes second. People who naturally attract trust often share this characteristic. They notice things, not in an intrusive way, not as a calculated strategy. They simply pay attention. They remember names because they care enough to remember them. They recall details from previous conversations because those details mattered. They ask one more question after everyone else would have moved on, not because they memorized a communication technique, but because genuine curiosity keeps them engaged. There is a significant difference between asking questions to appear interested and asking questions because you are interested. Most people can feel that difference immediately. Curiosity has a unique effect on human interaction. It quietly removes the spotlight from the self. When attention is directed toward understanding rather than performing, conversations become less exhausting. The pressure to appear intelligent begins to fade. The need to constantly manage impressions loses its grip. Instead of viewing another person as an audience evaluating your worth, you begin seeing them as a complex human being carrying experiences, fears, ambitions, and stories you know nothing about. That shift changes everything. The conversation no longer revolves around proving yourself. It becomes an opportunity to explore reality through someone else's perspective. And reality is always more interesting than performance. Every person possesses an inner world that remains largely invisible to those around them. Most interactions barely scratch the surface. People exchange facts, opinions, and routines while rarely touching the experiences that shape who they are. Genuine curiosity invites those deeper layers into the open. It creates space for honesty. It encourages reflection. It communicates, often without words, that what another person thinks and feels matters. When someone senses this kind of attention, a subtle transformation begins. Defenses lower. Responses become less guarded. The conversation gradually moves beyond rehearsed answers and predictable social patterns. Something more authentic starts to emerge. People reveal pieces of themselves they might normally keep hidden, not because they were persuaded to do so, but because they feel safe enough to do it naturally. Safety is one of the least discussed and most important ingredients in human connection. Trust grows within that environment, not all at once, not dramatically. It develops through small moments repeated consistently over time, a remembered detail, a thoughtful question, a patient silence, a willingness to listen without immediately redirecting the conversation back to oneself. These moments seem insignificant when viewed individually, yet together they create an impression that lasts. People remember how they felt around someone far longer than they remember specific words. The feeling of being understood leaves a deeper mark than the feeling of being entertained. Yet trust remains delicate. It can take weeks, months, or even years to build, while a single habit can begin eroding it almost immediately. The irony is that this habit often disguises itself as confidence, honesty, or strength. Many people engage in it without realizing the damage it causes. They assume they are creating connection when they are actually weakening it. And once this pattern becomes visible, it becomes impossible to ignore because it quietly undermines nearly every meaningful relationship a person hopes to build. A person can be admired from a distance and still feel deeply isolated. History is filled with examples of individuals who were respected, envied, and celebrated while remaining emotionally disconnected from those around them. The reason is simple. Perfection creates separation. When someone appears completely untouched by struggle, other people often find it difficult to see themselves in that person. They may appreciate what they observe, but they cannot fully relate to it. The relationship remains one-sided. Respect exists, yet genuine closeness struggles to emerge. Human beings connect through shared reality. They connect through limitations, challenges, setbacks, and imperfections. Not because suffering is attractive, but because honesty creates familiarity. There is something deeply reassuring about realizing that another person wrestles with many of the same fears, mistakes, and uncertainties that exist within yourself. The moment that realization appears, the interaction changes. The distance begins to shrink. What was once a performance becomes a conversation. What was once an image becomes a person. This is one of the reasons Stoic philosophy continues to resonate centuries after it was first written. The Stoics were not interested in appearing invulnerable. They were interested in understanding reality clearly. Marcus Aurelius, despite ruling one of the most powerful empires in history, filled his private reflections with reminders of his own weaknesses. He wrote about frustration, distraction, impatience, temptation, and the constant challenge of governing his own mind. These were not admissions of defeat, they were demonstrations of honesty. He possessed enough inner stability to look directly at his imperfections without feeling threatened by them. That kind of honesty requires a form of confidence that many people overlook. It is easy to project certainty when circumstances are favorable. It is much harder to acknowledge mistakes without immediately defending them. Yet the ability to do so reveals something important. It shows that self-worth is no longer dependent on appearing perfect. A person becomes free to acknowledge reality because their identity no longer depends on avoiding it. This freedom changes the entire tone of their interactions with others. People who naturally attract trust often display this quality without making a point of it. They do not pretend to know everything. They are comfortable saying, "I was wrong about that." They can admit when they misunderstood something. They can laugh at decisions that once embarrassed them. None of this feels forced because they are not using vulnerability as a strategy. They are simply being honest about the fact that they are human. The honesty itself becomes refreshing because it is increasingly uncommon. In many conversations, there is an unspoken competition taking place beneath the surface. People subtly attempt to establish competence, status, intelligence, or importance. They exaggerate accomplishments, minimize failures, redirect attention toward their strengths. The behavior is understandable. Most people want to be respected, yet these efforts often create an unintended consequence. They make interactions feel heavy. The conversation becomes less about understanding each other and more about managing impressions. Everyone leaves feeling slightly exhausted without fully understanding why. The atmosphere changes when someone no longer feels compelled to prove themselves. The pressure disappears. Others stop feeling evaluated. They stop worrying about how they compare. The conversation becomes lighter because it is no longer serving as a stage for self-promotion. It becomes a place where people can think openly, speak honestly, and engage without constantly protecting an image. That sense of ease is surprisingly powerful. Many people spend so much time around performances that authenticity immediately stands out. There is also a subtle strength in being able to acknowledge limitations without becoming defined by them. Some people avoid discussing mistakes because they fear appearing weak. Others swing to the opposite extreme and turn every flaw into a public display. Neither approach creates genuine connection. One hides reality, the other performs it. What creates trust is something much quieter. It is the ability to acknowledge imperfections without becoming consumed by them. The mistake is recognized, learned from, and integrated into a larger understanding of oneself. This balanced approach has a calming effect on those around it. People begin to feel that they do not need to maintain their own performances either. They become more comfortable admitting uncertainty, more willing to share honest thoughts, more willing to reveal concerns they might otherwise conceal. Authenticity has a tendency to invite authenticity. The permission one person gives themselves often becomes permission for others as well. As this dynamic develops, something interesting begins to happen. The focus gradually shifts away from attracting approval altogether. Conversations become less concerned with being impressive and more concerned with being real. The need to control how every word is received starts to loosen its grip. A different kind of confidence emerges, one rooted not in admiration but in self-acceptance. And perhaps this is why the people who draw others toward them most naturally are often the ones thinking about themselves the least. Their attention is no longer trapped in the endless task of maintaining an image. It is free to engage with the world as it is and with the people standing directly in front of them. Much of human behavior is shaped by a desire that rarely announces itself openly. It operates quietly beneath decisions, conversations, ambitions, and even personal identities. The desire to be accepted, to be respected, to be appreciated, to feel that one's existence has been acknowledged and valued by others. On the surface, these motivations seem harmless. In many ways, they are deeply human. People are social creatures, and connection has always played an important role in survival and belonging. Yet there is a significant difference between appreciating approval and depending on it. That difference often determines whether a person remains guided by their own principles or becomes subtly directed by the expectations of everyone around them. Many individuals spend years adapting themselves to fit what they believe others want. The process usually happens gradually. Certain opinions are softened, certain traits are hidden, certain behaviors are emphasized because they receive positive reactions. Over time, these adjustments accumulate. What begins as a small effort to gain acceptance can eventually become a habit of self-editing. A person may not even realize how much of their behavior is being shaped by external validation. They simply notice that certain actions produce approval while others produce discomfort, and without conscious reflection, they begin organizing themselves around those reactions. The Stoics recognized this tendency as one of the most subtle threats to personal freedom. Their concern was not that approval itself was harmful. Approval can be pleasant, respect can be valuable, positive relationships can enrich life. The danger emerges when emotional stability becomes dependent upon these things. The moment someone needs constant validation to feel secure, control begins shifting away from them. Their mood rises and falls according to opinions they cannot fully influence. Their confidence becomes conditional. Their peace becomes negotiable. In effect, portions of their inner life are handed over to forces beyond their control. This dependency often reveals itself in surprisingly ordinary situations. A delayed response to a message creates anxiety. A disagreement feels like rejection. A lack of recognition feels like failure. Criticism lingers in the mind for days, while praise fades within hours. The emotional reaction may seem connected to the event itself, but the deeper issue is usually the meaning attached to it. External approval has quietly become a source of emotional fuel. When it arrives, everything feels stable. When it disappears, uncertainty rushes in to replace it. People are often more aware of this dependency in others than they are in themselves. There is a certain tension that emerges when someone is constantly seeking reassurance. Their words seem carefully designed to gain agreement. Their opinions shift depending on the audience. Their confidence appears strong until it encounters resistance. None of this necessarily makes them dishonest. More often, it reflects an underlying fear of disapproval. Yet others can sense it. Just as insecurity communicates itself without words, so does dependence on validation. Epictetus pointed directly at this tendency when he said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." The moment a person stops making approval the measure of their worth, they begin to carry themselves differently, and people notice. This kind of independence should not be confused with indifference. Some people respond to the dangers of approval seeking by withdrawing emotionally. They convince themselves that caring less is the solution. Yet genuine independence is not coldness. It is not detachment from human connection. It is the ability to care without becoming controlled, to value relationships without becoming dependent upon them, to express ideas honestly without requiring universal agreement. The distinction matters because one creates distance while the other creates freedom. There is a quiet confidence that emerges from this freedom. It rarely announces itself. It does not need to dominate conversations or attract attention. In fact, it often appears remarkably ordinary. The person simply seems comfortable with differing opinions, comfortable with uncertainty, comfortable with not being everyone's favorite person. This comfort communicates something powerful. It suggests that their identity is rooted in something deeper than immediate social feedback. Ironically, this is often what attracts people in the first place. Many assume attraction is created through effort, performance, or persuasion. Yet there is something inherently appealing about someone who remains composed regardless of how much attention they receive. Their steadiness creates a sense of reliability. Others feel less pressure around them because they are not being asked to provide constant affirmation. The interaction feels lighter, more genuine, more relaxed. Certainty has a calming effect on the human mind. Not certainty in the sense of believing one knows everything, but certainty in the sense of being anchored within oneself. Life is unpredictable. Opinions change. Circumstances shift. People come and go. Someone who remains grounded amid those fluctuations naturally stands out. Their composure becomes a reference point in environments where emotions frequently rise and fall. They do not absorb every wave of approval or criticism. They remain centered while others are pulled in different directions. Yet, strength alone does not create lasting influence. Stability may earn respect, but respect by itself rarely creates deep connection. Human beings are drawn to competence, but they are also drawn to kindness. They admire self-possession, but they remember generosity. The strongest presence often belongs not to the person who needs nothing from others, but to the person who possesses enough inner security to give something to them. And that shift changes the entire nature of connection. The way people respond to another person's success reveals far more than they often realize. Most reactions appear positive on the surface. A smile is offered, congratulations are given, supportive words are spoken. Everything seems appropriate, Yet beneath that outward response, a very different process sometimes unfolds. Comparison begins quietly. Attention shifts away from the achievement itself and toward what it appears to say about one's own position. Another person's victory becomes a mirror, and instead of appreciating what is reflected in their life, many immediately begin evaluating what seems absent from their own. The achievement is no longer viewed as an isolated event. It becomes a measurement, a ranking, a subtle reminder of where they believe they stand. The Stoics paid close attention to this habit because they understood its hidden cost. Envy is often mistaken for a problem that harms relationships, but its deepest damage occurs internally. It slowly alters perception. Instead of seeing reality clearly, a person begins filtering everything through a lens of scarcity. Every achievement becomes evidence that there is less available. Every success becomes something to compete against rather than appreciate. The result is a constant state of dissatisfaction. Even positive experiences lose their ability to bring contentment because attention remains fixed on what someone else possesses. There is another way of seeing things, and it begins with a simple realization. Another person's success takes nothing away from your own potential. Their achievement does not reduce your possibilities. Their progress does not diminish your value. Yet this truth often remains hidden beneath years of conditioning that encourage competition in nearly every area of life. People are taught to compare grades, careers, accomplishments, possessions, and social standing. Over time, comparison begins to feel normal. What feels normal, however, is not always what is healthy. Those who possess a stronger presence tend to understand this instinctively. When someone else succeeds, they allow themselves to appreciate it fully. They do not search for reasons to minimize it. They do not immediately redirect attention back to themselves. They do not secretly hope the achievement fails to last. Instead, they become genuinely enthusiastic. They celebrate freely. They encourage openly. They recognize that another person's victory is not a threat. It is simply a victory. This sounds simple, yet it is surprisingly uncommon. Genuine enthusiasm for another person's success requires a certain level of inner security. Without that security, celebration becomes difficult because every achievement feels connected to personal worth. With that security, something changes. A person becomes capable of appreciating success wherever it appears. They can admire excellence without feeling diminished by it. They can acknowledge someone else's strengths without questioning their own. This creates a quality that people remember. Most individuals encounter enough competition throughout their lives. They experience criticism, comparison, judgment, and subtle forms of rivalry on a regular basis. Because of this, genuine encouragement stands out. It feels different. It feels rare. When someone responds to good news with authentic excitement, the reaction leaves an impression, not because the words themselves are extraordinary, but because the emotional experience is. The other person feels supported rather than evaluated. They feel celebrated rather than compared against. These moments accumulate over time. A remembered achievement, a sincere compliment, a genuine expression of happiness when things go well. Individually, they may seem small. Collectively, they create something much larger. People begin forming an impression that extends beyond any single interaction. A reputation slowly emerges, not necessarily for being impressive, accomplished, or influential, but for being uplifting, for making others feel encouraged, for contributing positive energy rather than competition. Perhaps this is one of the least discussed forms of influence. It does not rely on authority, status, or persuasion. It emerges from the ability to elevate the people around you, to leave conversations with others feeling more hopeful, more confident, and more appreciated than before. Few qualities create stronger connections than that. Yet even this rests upon something deeper. Encouragement, generosity, emotional independence, authenticity, and presence all emerge from the same underlying source. Remove that foundation, and the habits begin to feel forced. Strengthen it, and everything else starts to happen naturally. And that final shift changes not only how people experience you, but how you experience yourself. Most people move through their days without fully experiencing them. Their bodies occupy the present moment, but their minds are somewhere else entirely. Part of their attention is replaying conversations that ended yesterday. Another part is rehearsing situations that have not yet happened. Regrets compete with worries. Old mistakes compete with future uncertainties. Hours pass this way. Conversations occur. Opportunities appear and disappear. Entire experiences unfold, yet much of it barely registers because awareness is constantly being pulled away from what is happening now. This pattern feels normal, largely because it is so common. Many people assume that mental distraction is simply part of life. They become accustomed to carrying an endless stream of internal commentary wherever they go. While speaking to one person, they are thinking about another. While eating a meal, they are planning the next task. While sitting in a room, they are mentally revisiting events that can no longer be changed. The mind develops a habit of living almost everywhere except the place where life is actually occurring. Over time, this habit becomes so automatic that it often escapes notice entirely. The Stoics repeatedly return to a simple but demanding principle. Pay attention, not next week, not when circumstances improve, not after every problem has been solved, now. The instruction sounds straightforward, yet it may be one of the most difficult disciplines a person can practice. Attention requires effort because the mind naturally drifts toward distraction. It seeks stimulation, certainty, and escape. Remaining present means resisting that impulse and returning again and again to what is directly in front of you. This begins with small observations: the tone of someone's voice, the atmosphere of a room, the expression that briefly crosses a person's face before they answer a question, the subtle signs of excitement, discomfort, confidence, or hesitation that often go unnoticed. These details are always present, yet many people miss them because they are too occupied by their own internal dialogue. They enter conversations focused primarily on themselves. What should I say next? How am I being perceived? Am I making a good impression? These concerns consume attention that could otherwise be used to observe reality more clearly. Attention has become increasingly valuable precisely because it has become increasingly rare. In a world where distraction is constant, genuine observation stands out. Most people are accustomed to receiving partial attention. They are listened to while someone checks a phone, acknowledged while someone thinks about something else, heard without truly being understood. Because of this, the experience of being genuinely noticed feels surprisingly powerful. It creates an impression that lingers long after specific words have been forgotten. Marcus Aurelius captured the importance of this kind of presence when he wrote, "Confine yourself to the present." Few gifts are more meaningful than giving another person the one thing so many have lost: your full attention in the moment you share together. People can sense when they are being observed with genuine interest, not analyzed, not judged, simply noticed. The difference matters. Judgment creates tension. Observation creates understanding. When someone feels truly seen, they begin relaxing into the interaction. Defenses lower. Responses become more authentic. The conversation gains depth because neither person is trapped inside a performance. Instead of exchanging carefully managed versions of themselves, they begin meeting each other more honestly. This ability cannot be separated from awareness. No communication technique can replace it. No strategy can imitate it convincingly for long. Genuine attention changes interactions because it changes perception first. A person notices more, understands more, and therefore responds differently. Their words carry greater weight because those words emerge from observation rather than assumption. Their presence feels stronger because their attention is not scattered across countless internal distractions. Many people search for ways to become more influential without realizing that influence often begins with observation. They focus on speaking more effectively while overlooking the importance of seeing more clearly. Yet the quality of responses depends upon the quality of attention that precedes them. A person who notices little can only respond to little. A person who notices much has access to a far richer understanding of what is actually taking place. Over time, this habit begins affecting more than conversations. It changes the way life itself is experienced. Ordinary moments become more vivid. Relationships become more meaningful. Small details gain significance because they are finally being perceived rather than overlooked. The world feels less mechanical and more alive, not because circumstances have changed, but because awareness has deepened. Reality often becomes more interesting once a person begins paying attention to it. Perhaps this is why so many qualities associated with personal magnetism seem difficult to manufacture. Presence, warmth, depth, and connection are not isolated traits that can simply be adopted. They emerge naturally when attention moves away from constant self-preoccupation and toward genuine engagement with the world. The person who notices more inevitably understands more. The person who understands more inevitably connects more deeply. The process unfolds almost on its own, and that may be the final realization hiding beneath everything discussed so far. The qualities people find most compelling rarely begin with other people at all. They begin with the relationship a person has with their own attention. Once awareness becomes steady, authenticity becomes easier, generosity becomes easier, confidence becomes quieter and more stable, connection becomes more natural. What once looked like charisma reveals itself as something far simpler and far deeper. Not performance, not manipulation, not charm. Just the rare ability to be fully present in a world that is constantly trying to pull attention somewhere else. By this point, a pattern has likely begun to emerge. The ideas explored so far may have appeared to focus on conversations, relationships, and the qualities that naturally draw people closer. Yet beneath all of them lies something far more fundamental. None of these habits were really about attracting others, at least not in the way most people imagine. They were never about learning how to become more persuasive, more impressive, or more socially skilled. The deeper purpose was always internal. Every habit pointed back toward the same place, the way a person relates to themselves. Because long before anyone influences a room, they are influenced by the condition of their own mind. This is why so many attempts at personal transformation fail. People often focus on external behaviors while ignoring the internal patterns that produce them. They try to appear calm without addressing the anxiety underneath. They attempt to sound confident while remaining dependent on approval. They practice communication techniques while neglecting genuine curiosity. For a short time, these efforts can create results. That gradual nature is precisely what makes the process so powerful. Lasting change is rarely built through intensity. It is built through consistency. A conversation at a time. A decision at a time, a day at a time. Most people underestimate the influence of small choices because they focus on immediate results. They want visible progress, instant transformation, clear evidence that their efforts are working. Yet, the most important developments often remain invisible for long periods. Character grows beneath the surface long before it becomes visible to others. Eventually, those repeated choices begin forming habits. What once required conscious effort starts becoming natural. Listening deeply no longer feels like a technique. Patience no longer feels like restraint. Authenticity no longer feels risky. The behaviors stop feeling separate from identity because they have been integrated into it. This is where something important begins to shift. A person is no longer trying to act differently. They have become different through practice. Habits, when repeated long enough, shape character. Character, in turn, influences every interaction. Not because it changes what someone says, but because it changes the energy from which those words emerge. Two people can speak the exact same sentence and create completely different impressions. The difference often lies beneath the words themselves. One speaks from insecurity, the other speaks from certainty. One seeks validation, the other expresses a genuine perspective. The language may be identical, yet the experience feels entirely different. Over time, character becomes visible in ways that cannot easily be imitated. It appears in moments of pressure, in moments of uncertainty, in moments where there is nothing to gain from pretending. People begin sensing a consistency between what someone says and who they are. Trust grows because there is less contradiction between appearance and reality. Others stop feeling as though they are interacting with a carefully constructed image. They feel they are interacting with a real person. Then something unusual begins to happen. The interactions that once felt difficult become easier. Conversations flow more naturally. People seem more receptive. Trust develops more quickly. Opportunities for connection appear without being forced. At first glance, it may seem as though others have changed. Yet the deeper truth is often the opposite. The person has changed. The quality of attention they bring into situations has changed. The emotional atmosphere they create has changed. As a result, the responses they receive begin changing as well. This is often the point where many misunderstand what is happening. They assume they have discovered a method for influencing people. In reality, they have discovered something far more valuable. They have reduced the internal obstacles that once prevented genuine connection. They are no longer trapped by constant self-consciousness, no longer driven by comparison, no longer controlled by the need for approval. The energy once spent managing these distractions becomes available for something more meaningful, and because of that, they walk into a room differently, not with greater force, not with greater effort, simply with greater presence. Others respond to it because authenticity is easier to trust than performance. Calmness is easier to trust than anxiety. Someone who no longer feels compelled to prove their worth creates a sense of ease that affects everyone around them. There is something profoundly compelling about a person who is comfortable being exactly who they are. Not because they believe they are perfect, but because they no longer need perfection to feel secure. In the end, that may be the deepest form of magnetism that exists. It is not created by controlling others. It emerges naturally when there is finally nothing left to prove. The truth is that the most magnetic people are rarely the ones trying to be magnetic. They are simply present. They listen when others are distracted. They remain steady when others are reactive. They focus on growth instead of comparison, understanding instead of judgment, and character instead of appearance. And over time, those small choices create a presence that no technique can imitate. Remember, every meaningful transformation begins the same way. One thought, one decision, one moment of awareness at a time. Keep practicing, keep observing, and keep becoming the person you would respect most. If this reflection resonated with you, take a moment to watch one of the videos on your screen now. Continue the journey. Continue strengthening the mind. Continue building the kind of character that remains steady in any circumstance. And thank you for being part of Stoic Journal. Until next time, take care of your mind, and everything else will follow.